New York, December 2nd, 1936. Inside a Park Avenue apartment, the air is cold. But the silence is even colder. John Ringling is dying. He's doing it with less money in his pocket than the man who parks his cars. His bank balance, verified by probate court records filed 3 days after his death, shows exactly $311. 311. This is a man who once controlled $200 million. In today's money, that's roughly $3.5 billion. The 10th richest person in the world, reduced to pocket change. But here's what makes this more than just another rags to rags story. 1,500 miles south, sitting empty on the edge of Sarasota Bay, is the most expensive tomb in North America. C.A. Dizan, the House of John. A Venetian palace that cost $1.5 million to build. That's over $25 million in today's terms. 36,000 square feet of marble, gold leaf, and imported tile. It's been locked for months. Cobwebs stretch across doorways. Salt air is slowly eating through the window seals. And inside, hanging on walls that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, are paintings by Rubens, Velázquez, and Hals. Masterpieces gathering dust in the Florida humidity. Most documentaries about C.A. Dizan will walk you through the ballrooms and tell you about the imported Venetian tiles. They'll show you the grand staircase and talk about the parties. But we're not doing a tour. We're performing an autopsy. Because this palace wasn't built to celebrate success. It was built to prove something, to buy something that money, it turned out, couldn't purchase. And over the next hour, we're going to examine exactly how a man who revolutionized American entertainment, who monopolized an entire industry, who collected art like emperors collected kingdoms, ended up dying alone with $311, while his dream house slowly rotted on a Florida beach. We have the court documents. We have the architectural blueprints. We have the servant testimonies. And we're going to show you the machinery behind the marble, the invisible hands that built the fantasy, the precise moment when ambition stopped being a ladder and became a cage. This isn't the story they tell on the official tour. If you enjoy deep investigations into Gilded Age architecture, the kind that goes beyond the pretty pictures to examine the human cost and the mechanical reality, please like and subscribe. This channel is built on forensic detail, not tourist propaganda. The body is John Ringling's empire. The crime scene is C.A. Dizan. Let's begin the examination. But before we can understand how he died, we need to see what he left behind. We need to walk through the most expensive mausoleum ever built on American soil. Sarasota, Florida. Same day, December 2nd, 1936. 3 security guards patrol the grounds of C.A. Dizan. They're not protecting against thieves. They're protecting against creditors. The main doors are chained. Every window on the first floor is shuttered. The gondola John imported from Venice sits motionless in its covered dock, canvas rotting in the salt air. This is what $25 million of marble and gold looks like when no one lives inside. From the bay, it still looks magnificent. 5 stories of pink and cream terracotta rising against the Florida sky. A bell tower modeled after the one in Venice's Piazza San Marco. Balconies with wrought iron railings that cost more than a house. But get closer, and you start to see the cracks. Literally. The imported Venetian tiles on the terrace, the ones John paid craftsmen to distress by hand so they'd look authentically ancient, are now actually ancient. Salt has worked its way into the mortar. Some have already fallen loose. Inside, through the windows on the upper floors where the shutters don't quite close, you can see furniture covered in white sheets, ghost shapes in dim light. The pipe organ, the one with 4,000 pipes hidden in the walls and ceiling, hasn't played in months. Humidity is warping the wood. Rust is forming on the metal. In the basement, where the servants used to work 15-hour days maintaining the illusion of effortless luxury upstairs, the boilers are cold. The laundry machines are silent. The dumbwaiters that carried champagne and caviar from the kitchens to the ballrooms no longer move. The house that was supposed to prove John Ringling belonged among America's elite has become evidence of exactly the opposite. It proved that you can buy Venetian palaces, European art, and imported craftsmen. But you cannot buy permanence, you cannot buy legitimacy, and you definitely cannot buy your way out of loneliness. CA, Dazan was never really a home. It was a statement, a threat, a monument, built by a man who spent his entire life being told he wasn't good enough, trying to build something so magnificent that no one could ever say that again. He succeeded at building it, but the cost wasn't measured in dollars. To understand what this palace really cost, we need to go back to where it all started, to a place as far from Venetian luxury as you can imagine, to 5 brothers in the frozen mud of Wisconsin, hungry enough to gamble everything on an idea that would change American entertainment forever. Baraboo, Wisconsin, winter 1882. 5 boys are sleeping in a room meant for 2. The Ringling brothers, Albert, Otto, Alfred, Charles, and John. The youngest, John, is 16 years old. Their father, August, is a harness maker, which means the family survives, barely, on the few dollars farmers can spare when their horses need new leather straps. Most nights, there isn't enough food, the kind of hunger that makes you wake up with your stomach trying to eat itself. This is the soil John Ringling grew from. Not poverty as a story, poverty as physics, as cold that gets into your bones, as mathematics that never quite adds up to survival. The brothers had watched a traveling circus come through town the year before, a small operation, maybe 30 people, a few wagons, some trained dogs, and a tired elephant. But what struck John wasn't the performance, it was the economics. That circus charged 25 cents admission. 300 people showed up. That's $75 in a single night, more than their father made in a month. So the brothers did the math. They pooled together $350. Everything they had, money saved from odd jobs, from helping harvest, from anything that paid. In 1884, they launched the Ringling Bros Circus. It started small, a single wagon, some juggling, a dancing bear they'd bought from another bankrupt showman. They moved town to town on dirt roads, sleeping under wagons when it rained. But here's where John's mind worked differently than other circus owners. Most circuses were stuck in a geographic cage. You could only reach towns within a day's wagon travel. That meant maybe 50 towns a year. That meant you exhausted your audience fast. But in 1884, America was stitching itself together with railroad tracks. 35,000 miles of track already laid, with more being added every month. John saw the rail lines as more than transportation. He saw them as distribution infrastructure. In 1886, the Ringling brothers bought their first train car. By 1890, they had 15 cars. By 1900, they had 45. This wasn't just about moving faster, it was about scale. With wagons, you brought the circus to one town at a time. With trains, you could leapfrog across entire states, hit a town on Monday, be 300 miles away by Thursday. More towns meant more revenue. More revenue meant you could afford better acts. Better acts meant you could charge more. Higher prices meant better towns would let you in. It was a flywheel, and John understood exactly how to spin it. By 1907, Ringling Brothers had become the largest circus in America. They'd absorbed smaller competitors, bought out rivals, and systematically destroyed anyone who tried to challenge them. Revenue that year, roughly $5 million. In today's money, that's about $150 million annually. John personally controlled half of it. The boy who'd gone to bed hungry in Iowa was now a millionaire many times over. He owned railcars. He owned acts. He owned the distribution network that made the whole thing possible. But here's what the money couldn't do. It couldn't make the Vanderbilts return his dinner invitations. It couldn't get him into the clubs on Fifth Avenue. It couldn't make New York society stop calling him the circus man with that particular tone that meant you'd never really belong. John had conquered logistics. He built a monopoly. He'd accumulated wealth that would make him one of the richest men in America. But in the eyes of old money, in the drawing rooms where real power lived, he was still just the harness-maker's son who'd gotten lucky with trained elephants. That rejection, that invisible wall, was about to reshape the American coastline. That rejection, that invisible wall, was about to cost him everything. But first, in 1907, he was going to make the power move that would put every circus in America under his control. New York City, July 8, 1907. John Ringling walks into the offices of Barnum & Bailey's greatest show on earth. The circus that had been his competitor, his benchmark, his obsession for 2 decades. He's there to buy it. Not merge with it, not partner with it, buy it outright. The price, $400,000, roughly $12 million in today's money. When the deal closes, John Ringling controls 90% of the American circus industry. Every major act, every major route, every train car that matters. It's the kind of monopoly that would make Rockefeller nod with approval. He's 41 years old. He's worth an estimated $200 million in modern terms. He owns the entire entertainment infrastructure of traveling shows in America. But that same year, something else happens that matters just as much. John tries to join the Metropolitan Club in New York, the club where the real power brokers gather. The Vanderbilts, the Astors. The men whose grandfathers had money when John's grandfather was still shoeing horses in Germany. His application is rejected. No explanation given. None needed. The message is clear. You can own the circus, but you can't sit with us. This is the wound that never heals, the specific kind of humiliation that only matters to people who've already conquered everything else. John had beaten poverty. He'd built an empire. He'd accumulated more wealth than most of these men would ever see. But he couldn't buy his way past their invisible wall. So he stopped trying to join their world. He decided to build his own. The next year, 1908, John buys land in Sarasota, Florida. Not just a lot, 66,000 acres, an entire kingdom's worth. Sarasota in 1908 is basically a fishing village. A few hundred people. Dirt roads. Mosquitoes the size of hummingbirds. The kind of place where malaria is just part of summer. But John sees something else. He sees warm winters. He sees bay frontage. He sees a place where there is no old money, because there's barely any money at all. He can be the Vanderbilt here, the Astor, the man who defines what civilization looks like. In 1911, he buys more land, builds roads, funds the construction of a causeway to connect the barrier islands, starts developing what will become downtown Sarasota. He's not just buying property, he's buying the ability to be first, to have his name on the hospital, the bank, the causeway, to be the old money instead of forever chasing it. But land development isn't enough. Civic infrastructure isn't enough. What he needs is a palace, something so undeniably magnificent that when the Vanderbilts winter in Florida, they'll have to acknowledge it. They'll have to see it from their yachts and know that the circus man built something they cannot ignore. In 1912, John marries Mabel Burton. She's 33, cultured, educated, fluent in French and Italian. The daughter of a businessman, not an immigrant harness maker. And critically, she has taste. European taste. The kind that knows the difference between expensive and elegant. Mabel becomes John's compass, his translator into the world of art and architecture that old money uses as a language of belonging. Together they start traveling to Europe, not as tourists, as collectors. They buy paintings, tapestries, entire rooms of furniture. They study palaces in Venice, villas in Florence, estates in the French countryside. They're not just shopping, they're learning the vocabulary. And in 1924, after more than a decade of preparation, of accumulating both the money and the knowledge, John tells Mabel he's ready. He's going to build their palace, right on Sarasota Bay, where everyone can see it. It's going to be Venetian, because Venice is where merchant princes built beauty out of commerce, where traders became nobility. It's going to be impossible to ignore, and it's going to cost whatever it costs, because this isn't about shelter, it's not about comfort. It's about proving that the harness maker's son belongs in the same conversation as the people who wouldn't let him through their doors. He was wrong about what it would prove, but he wouldn't know that for another 12 years. The construction of C.A. Design begins in 1924, but before we walk through those Venetian rooms, we need to understand the woman who designed them. Because without Mabel, John would have just built an expensive house. With her, he built something far more dangerous, a monument to everything he thought he wanted. December 29, 1905, Hoboken, New Jersey. John Ringling, 40 years old, worth millions, controller of the greatest traveling show on earth, gets married. His bride is Arminta Mabel Burton, 33 years old, daughter of a businessman from Ohio, educated, refined, fluent in French and Italian. On paper, it looks like a sensible match. A successful man finds a respectable wife. But this wasn't a marriage. It was a strategic alliance. John had conquered the mechanics of wealth. He knew how to move trains, negotiate contracts, crush competitors. He understood numbers, leverage, and power. But he didn't understand beauty. Not the kind that opened doors in New York drawing rooms. Not the kind that separated old money from new. Not the kind that came from knowing which fork to use, which paintings to praise, which composers to quote at dinner parties. Mabel understood all of it. She'd grown up in a world where culture was currency, where the difference between Baroque and Rococo actually mattered, where knowing that Titian used Venetian red could determine whether you were invited back. John didn't need a wife. He needed a translator. And Mabel, looking at this broad-shouldered circus magnate with his loud voice and expensive but slightly wrong suits, saw something else. She saw raw material, a fortune large enough to become legacy, if guided properly. She saw a man who could afford to collect emperors, possessions, but didn't yet know which emperors mattered. So she became his compass. Their honeymoon wasn't to Niagara Falls. It was to Europe. 6 months traveling through France, Italy, Germany, Austria. But they weren't tourists. They were students. Mabel walked John through the Louvre, through the Uffizi, through private collections in Venetian palazzos. She taught him to see paintings not as decorations, but as statements, not as purchases, but as patrimony. She showed him how European aristocrats had transformed merchant wealth into multi-generational prestige, how the Medici banking family became the Medici dynasty by collecting Botticelli and Michelangelo, how Venetian traders built palaces on canal water to prove they belonged in the same sentence as kings. John was a fast learner when the lesson involved power. In 1910, they returned to Europe, this time not to learn, to acquire. John bought a Rubens, The Gathering of the Manna, roughly $60,000. That's over $2 million in today's money, for a single painting. Then a Velázquez, then a Frans Hals, then another Rubens, and another. He wasn't collecting art. He was stockpiling proof. Proof that the circus man could own the same objects that hung in royal palaces, that his walls could display the same masters as the Vanderbilts, that his taste, or at least his wife's taste, was indistinguishable from theirs. By 1925, John and Mabel owned over 600 paintings. The collection was valued at $20 million. In today's terms, roughly $350 million. It was one of the largest private art collections in America, larger than some museums. But here's what makes this different from simple acquisition. Mabel wasn't just buying paintings. She was building a narrative. Every purchase was documented. Every painting came with provenance, royal collections, Habsburg estates, papal inventories. She was creating a paper trail that connected John Ringling not to traveling performers and trained elephants, but to Renaissance popes and Venetian doges. She was rewriting his origin story in oil and canvas. And it worked, partially. Art critics started taking John seriously. Museum curators consulted with him. His collection was featured in national publications. But the Metropolitan Club still didn't send an invitation. The Astors still didn't come to dinner. Because old money understood something that John and Mabel were still learning. You can buy the paintings, you can buy the expertise, you can even buy the critics. But you cannot buy the one thing that actually matters. Time. Old money's power came from being there first. From having grandfathers whose names were on hospitals before those hospitals existed. From inherited social debt that accumulated over generations. John was trying to purchase in a decade what they'd inherited over a century. It was never going to work. But Mabel had one more card to play. If they couldn't buy their way into existing palaces, they'd build their own. Not in New York, where every stone would be compared to Vanderbilt estates and found wanting. In Florida, on the bay, where there were no Vanderbilts to compete with. In 1923, Mabel shows John sketches of Venetian palaces she'd studied during their travels. C.A. Doro, the Doge's Palace, the waterfront estates where merchant princes lived like kings. She tells him they can build their own, not a copy, an interpretation, an American Venice. A place where the paintings they've collected would have a home worthy of their provenance, where European aristocrats, wintering in Florida, would sail past and see not a circus man's house, but a legitimate palace, where their name would be carved into marble that would outlast the Metropolitan Club, the Astors, and every other institution that had refused to let them in. John agrees immediately, not because he cares about Venetian architecture, but because he understands the logic. If you can't join the existing hierarchy, you build a parallel one. You create new rules where you're automatically at the top. In 1924, they hired Dwight James Baum, an architect from New York, who designed estates for wealthy clients. But this commission is different. Mabel doesn't want a house. She wants a conversion machine, a physical structure that transforms circus money into cultural legitimacy. She specifies Venetian Gothic, terracotta from the same quarries that supplied the Doge's Palace, marble from the same Italian mountains, tiles that must be artificially aged to look authentically medieval. She's not designing a home. She's designing evidence. Evidence that the Ringlings belong in the same aesthetic universe as European nobility. The budget is $1.5 million, over $25 million today. Construction begins in 1924. It will take 2 years to build. And when it's finished, it will be the most expensive private residence in Florida. 36,000 square feet, 56 rooms. A bell tower visible from 5 miles out on the bay. A palace built to prove something that cannot be proven by architecture alone. But John and Mabel don't know that yet. Right now, in 1924, as the first terracotta tiles are being imported from Italy, as the first marble is being carved in Carrara, as the blueprints spread across Dwight Baum's drafting table, they believe they're building their triumph. They believe the palace will finally force New York to recognize what it had refused to see. They're wrong. But the house will be magnificent anyway. And now, finally, we can walk through those rooms. We can see exactly what $1.5 million bought them. We can examine the machinery of illusion that Mabel designed and John paid for. We can step inside C.A. Design, the house of John, and perform the autopsy room by room. Sarasota, Florida, 1926. C.A. Design is complete. You approach from the bay, which is how it's meant to be seen. Not from a driveway, but from the water, the way Venetian palaces were approached by gondola. The first thing you see is the bell tower, 80 feet tall, modeled after the Campanile in Venice's Piazza San Marco, visible for miles. It's not functional, it doesn't ring hours, it doesn't signal anything. It's a vertical statement, a finger pointing at the sky saying, "Here." The facade is 5 stories of pink and cream terracotta, 36,000 square feet. The tiles were made in Italy, then deliberately distressed by hand to look centuries old. Authentically fake antiquity, a brand new building pretending to have witnessed the Renaissance. You dock at the marble terrace. The floor is laid in a geometric pattern copied from the courtyard of the Doge's palace, each piece of marble imported from Carrara, the same quarries that supplied Michelangelo. This detail matters to Mabel, not because anyone will notice, but because she'll know. Because when she mentions it casually at dinner, it connects C.A. Design to a 500-year lineage of European artistic patronage. The front doors are 15 feet tall, carved walnut, bronze hardware cast to match medieval Venetian designs. You push them open, and you enter the court of a merchant prince. The living room is 43 feet long, 22 feet wide. The ceiling rises 23 feet above your head. Coffered and gilded, each panel painted with a different Renaissance motif, cherubs, laurel wreaths, mythological scenes. It took 6 Italian craftsmen 8 months to complete this ceiling alone. The floor is Cuban tile, glazed in deep greens and golds, each tile individually hand-painted, then fired, then shipped across the Gulf of Mexico. The furniture is museum quality, 16th-century Italian credenzas, French Baroque chairs with original tapestry upholstery, tables that once sat in Habsburg palaces. None of it comfortable, all of it impressive. This room isn't designed for living. It's designed for entering, for the moment when guests walk in and their breath catches, when they look up at the gilded ceiling and understand, immediately, that they're not in someone's house. They're in a declaration. On the walls hang the Rubens paintings, the Velázquez, the Franz Hals portraits. Roughly $6 million worth of art, in today's money, just in this one room. The message is precise. We own what you only see in museums. Walk through to the ballroom. This is the heart of the performance, where Mabel's vision reaches its peak. The room is 36 feet long. Tall windows face the bay, flooding the space with light. The floor is polished terrazzo, mixed with crushed marble to give it a slight shimmer. The ceiling is barrel-vaulted and painted to resemble the sky. Clouds, blue atmosphere, as if you're standing outside, under heaven. Along one wall, hidden behind ornate grillwork and tapestries, are the pipes, 4,000 of them. This is the Aeolian pipe organ, custom-built, cost $60,000. That's over $2 million in today's money. But you can't see the pipes. You can't see the mechanism. The sound seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. Mabel designed it this way deliberately. She wanted music that sounded divine, sourceless, the voice of God filling the room. It's psychological architecture, sound designed to make guests feel small, awed, like they've entered a space where normal rules don't apply. At the far end of the ballroom is a stage, not a platform, an actual theater stage with curtains and footlights. Because sometimes, after dinner, Mabel would arrange performances. Opera singers she'd hired, string quartets, dramatic readings. The guests would sit in gilded chairs, champagne in hand, and watch professional entertainment in a private home. It was theater about theater, performance layered on performance. And the final layer, the view. The entire bay-facing wall is windows, floor to ceiling, facing west. Every evening, as the sun sets over Sarasota Bay, the ballroom fills with orange and gold light. The water reflects it back. The room glows. This wasn't accident. Mabel studied the light. She timed dinners to coincide with sunset. She understood that the most impressive moments aren't built, they're orchestrated. This is the C.A. Design that appears in photographs. The polished floors, the gilded ceilings, the art, the light. This is the palace that was meant to prove John Ringling belonged among America's elite. But this is only the stage. This is the performance space. And like all performances, it required machinery, infrastructure, invisible labor running underneath the beautiful surface. Because while guests danced in the ballroom under the voice of God organ music, while they sipped champagne and admired Rubens' paintings, and watched the sunset through floor-to-ceiling windows, there was another CA, Dazan, operating simultaneously. Below them, behind them, in spaces they were never meant to see. Let's go there now, because the real story of CA, Dazan, isn't in the ballroom. It's 40 feet below it, in the basement. It's behind the tapestries, in the servant corridors. It's in the thermal differential between the marble floors and the laundry room. It's in the machinery that made the illusion possible. The basement of CA Dazan is a different climate zone. Not metaphorically, literally. The ballroom upstairs, with its bay-facing windows and cross-ventilation, stays at a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit on summer days. The breeze from the Gulf keeps it cool. The basement, 40 feet below ground level, has no windows, no cross-ventilation, no breeze. In July, it reaches 94 degrees, sometimes higher. This is where the servants worked. At full operation CA, Dazan employed 42 people. 16 lived on the property. The rest came daily from Sarasota. The head butler, Charles Brennan, earned $1,200 per year, roughly $22,000 in today's money. The kitchen staff earned less, $600 annually. The laundry workers even less. For this, they worked 15-hour days when the house was entertaining, which was most of the winter season. Let's walk through their day. 4:30 a.m., the kitchen staff arrives. They fire up the coal-burning stoves. By 5 a.m., the kitchen is already 85 degrees. They are preparing breakfast for John and Mabel, which will be served upstairs at 9. That gives them 4 hours to bake fresh bread, prepare eggs, fruit, pastries. But they're also preparing for the dinner party that night. 12 guests, 7 courses. By 6 a.m., the laundry room is operational. 2 women standing over copper tubs filled with near-boiling water, washing the linens from yesterday's party. There are no machines. Everything is by hand. Scrubbing, wringing, hanging. The laundry room has one small vent. The humidity is close to 100%. By noon, both women's hands are swollen and red. Upstairs, in the ballroom, it's 72 degrees. A pleasant breeze. You could wear a suit comfortably. Meanwhile, the serving staff is using the hidden corridors. These corridors run behind the walls of every major room. 4 feet wide, undecorated, concrete floors, dim electric lighting. They're designed so servants can move through the house without being seen, so they can appear in the ballroom to refill champagne glasses, then disappear, like magic. The guests never see them arrive, never see them leave. It's the same principle as the pipe organ. The effect appears divine, sourceless, effortless. But the pipes are real. The servants are real. They're just hidden. Speaking of the organ, let me show you how it actually works. Behind the tapestry on the north wall of the ballroom are the organ pipes, 4,000 of them, arranged in ranks by size and tone. The smallest pipes are 8 inches tall. The largest are 32 feet. They're not in the ballroom itself. They're in a sealed chamber behind the wall, accessible only through a maintenance corridor. When Mabel plays the console, which sits against the east wall, she's not directly creating sound. She's sending pneumatic signals through a series of tubes. These tubes run through the walls, through the floor, into the pipe chamber. The air pressure opens valves. The valves release compressed air into specific pipes. The sound travels through acoustic channels built into the walls and ceiling. It emerges from grills hidden behind the decorative molding. That's why it sounds like it's coming from everywhere. Because it is. The entire room is the instrument. The system required constant maintenance. Someone had to tune 4,000 pipes. Someone had to clean them. Someone had to monitor the air pressure, repair the pneumatic tubes, replace worn valves. That someone was Ernest Halliday, the organ technician. He earned $900 per year. He worked in the pipe chamber. In summer, it was over 90 degrees. The humidity from the bay rusted the metal pipes. The salt air corroded the valves. He'd spend entire days in that sealed room, in the dark, in the heat, adjusting pipes so that when Mabel played Brahms for her dinner guests, the sound would be perfect. Divine, sourceless, effortless. Now let's go upstairs to Mabel's bedroom. This is the private cage. The room is 22 feet square. The bed is a custom Italian Baroque piece. Carved walnut. Gold leaf, a canopy of imported silk. But look at the windows. They're covered, not with curtains, with screens. Fine copper mesh screens that cover every window, every door to the balcony. Mosquitoes. Florida in the 1920s meant malaria, yellow fever, dengue, all carried by mosquitoes. The screens were essential, but they blocked the breeze. So Mabel's bedroom, despite facing the bay, despite the supposedly perfect climate, was stuffy, enclosed, airless on summer nights. She also suffered from chronic bronchitis. The humidity made it worse. She'd wake up at night, unable to breathe properly, trapped behind mosquito screens in a bedroom designed to look like a Venetian palazzo. The irony is precise. She built this palace to prove she belonged among European aristocracy. She filled it with Renaissance furniture and Habsburg credenzas. But she lived in it like a prisoner, behind screens, struggling to breathe, isolated on a Florida peninsula while New York society continued to exclude her. The palazzo was perfect. The performance was flawless. But Mabel was dying inside it. In 1929, her health deteriorated rapidly. Addison's disease, complicated by diabetes. The chronic bronchitis from Florida's humidity made everything worse. Doctors told her to leave Florida. But she couldn't leave, because leaving would mean admitting the palace failed, that the palazzo on Sarasota Bay wasn't actually equivalent to the estates in Newport or the Fifth Avenue mansions. She stayed, and on September 2nd, 1929, at age 54, Mabel Burton Ringling died in her Baroque bedroom behind copper screens. The palace she designed had become her mausoleum years before John's would. Downstairs, 42 servants received word that their employment status was now uncertain. Because Mabel was the one who ran the house, who knew which servants did what, who maintained the standards. Without her, C.A., Dazan stopped being a palazzo. It became just an expensive building that John didn't know how to operate. The invisible machine began breaking down immediately. And that same year, 1929, something else broke. Not just Mabel's health, not just the household machinery. The entire economic structure that had supported John's empire was about to collapse. And John, already grieving, was about to make the worst business decision of his life. October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday. The stock market loses 11% of its value at opening. By the end of the day, 12 million shares have been traded in panic selling. John Ringling's paper wealth evaporates, not entirely, but significantly. He still owns the circus. He still owns Florida real estate. He still owns the art collection. But his liquidity, his ability to move cash quickly, is suddenly limited. And John, grieving Mabel's death just 6 weeks earlier, makes a decision driven by emotion rather than economics. He decides to expand. In 1929, while the economy is collapsing, while banks are failing, while unemployment is beginning its climb to 25%, John Ringling borrows money to buy out competitors. He acquires 5 smaller circuses. He buys their routes, their equipment, their acts. The logic in his mind is sound. During a depression, assets are cheap. If he can consolidate the industry now, when others are desperate to sell, he'll emerge from the crisis with total dominance. It's the same strategy that worked in 1907 with Barnum and Bailey. But 1929 is not 1907. In 1907, the economy recovered quickly. Credit returned. People had money for entertainment. In 1929, the economy keeps falling. For years. By 1931, John has borrowed over $2 million. That's roughly $40 million in today's money. Most of it is backed by his Florida real estate and his art collection. But here's where the moral audit becomes unavoidable. While John is borrowing millions to expand his circus empire, the people who actually run the circus are suffering. The performers, the roustabouts, the animal handlers, the tent crews. In 1930, John cuts their wages by 30%. Not because the circus isn't profitable, but because his debt service requires it. A tent worker who was making $20 per week is now making $14. That's the difference between feeding a family and not feeding a family. Meanwhile, John spends $60,000 on a single Rembrandt painting, the portrait of a young man, roughly $1 million in today's money. He justifies this by arguing the art collection is an investment, that these paintings will appreciate, that they're assets. But you can't eat assets. The workers know this. They watch John buy paintings while their children go hungry. They watch him travel to New York for art auctions while they're sleeping in unheated train cars. The resentment builds. In 1932, there's a near mutiny. A group of performers refuses to go on unless wages are restored. John fires them. All of them. Hires replacements at even lower wages. He's treating human beings the same way he treats railroad cars, as interchangeable parts in a machine. This is the moment when John Ringling stops being a self-made success story and becomes something else, a symbol of exactly what's wrong with American capitalism during the Depression. A man who owns Renaissance paintings while the people who built his fortune starve. But the Depression isn't John's only problem. In 1930, less than a year after Mabel's death, John marries again. Her name is Emily Haig Buck, 32 years old. John is 64. This is not a love match. Emily's the widow of one of John's business associates. She's attractive, socially ambitious, and very aware that John is still, on paper, worth millions. The marriage is a disaster from the beginning. Emily wants the lifestyle, the palazzo, the art collection, the status. But she doesn't want John. She doesn't want a grieving 64-year-old man who spends his evenings staring at paintings of his dead wife's favorite Venetian scenes. They fight constantly, about money, about the house, about everything. Emily wants to redecorate C.A. Design. She wants to remove Mabel's furniture, Mabel's aesthetic, Mabel's ghost. John refuses. The house, to him, is a shrine. Changing it would be erasing the only thing he has left of Mabel. Within 2 years, they're separated. Within 3 years, they're in court. Emily is suing for divorce and demanding half of John's assets. She claims he misrepresented his wealth when they married, that she was promised a lifestyle he can no longer provide. The legal battle drags on for years. It's vicious, public, humiliating. Newspaper headlines call it the Circus King's Circus Divorce. The court depositions reveal the truth about John's finances. He's not worth $200 million anymore. He's not even worth $20 million. He's deeply in debt. The real estate has lost value. The circus is barely profitable. The only assets with real value are the art collection and C.A. Design itself. And both are tied up in legal complications. Meanwhile, The state of Florida is circling. In 1931, John had made a provisional agreement to donate his art collection and ca. Design to the state after his death. In exchange, the state would forgive certain tax debts and provide legal protection against creditors. It was supposed to be his redemption, his way of ensuring the collection stayed together, that his name would be on a museum forever. But the legal process is complicated. The paperwork isn't finalized, and as John's debts mount, creditors begin arguing they have first claim on the assets. By 1935, John is fighting wars on 3 fronts. First, Emily's divorce lawsuit, which is trying to seize half his remaining wealth. Second, creditors who want to liquidate the art collection to pay his debts. Third, the state of Florida, which wants the collection but won't accept it with attached debts. He's spending more on lawyers than he's earning from the circus. And he's doing all of this while his health is failing. In 1934, John suffers a stroke. Partial paralysis on his left side. His speech is slurred. He needs assistance walking. He's 70 years old, functionally broke, estranged from his second wife, with no children, no living siblings, and no close friends. The palace on Sarasota Bay sits mostly empty. He can't afford to maintain it. The servants are gone. The gardens are overgrown. Salt air is corroding the marble terraces. The art collection, the 600 paintings that were supposed to prove his cultural legitimacy, are hanging in dim rooms gathering dust because he can't afford to pay for proper climate control. The circus, the empire he built with his brothers from nothing, is being run by creditors who don't understand show business and don't care about legacy. They care about liquidation value. Everything John built is coming apart. Not because he was stupid, not because he didn't work hard, but because he built it all on a foundation of trying to prove something to people who were never going to acknowledge him anyway. The Metropolitan Club never sent that invitation. The Vanderbilts never came to ca. Design. The old money families of New York never accepted that a circus man with Venetian tiles and Rubens paintings belonged in their world. And by the time John realized this, by the time he understood that no amount of marble or Carrara or Renaissance art would ever buy him the one thing he actually wanted, it was too late. He'd spent everything chasing a door that was never going to open. In December 1936, living in a rented apartment on Park Avenue because he can't afford to heat ca. Design, John catches pneumonia. He's alone. Emily is in her own apartment, waiting for the divorce settlement. The servants are long gone. His attorney visits occasionally to discuss the legal battles. But there's no one who actually cares whether he lives or dies. On December 2nd, 1936, at 1:30 in the afternoon, John Nicholas Ringling dies. The doctors list cause of death as bronchopneumonia and heart failure. But the real cause was simpler. He died of trying to buy something that wasn't for sale. His bank balance, $311. His debts, over $7 million in today's money. His legacy, a locked palace in Florida, and a lawsuit over who gets to liquidate it. The greatest showman in American history died without an audience. But the story doesn't end with John's death, because 1,500 miles south, ca. Design still stands. Empty, locked, slowly rotting in the Florida humidity. And what happens to it over the next 10 years is its own kind of tragedy, a physical manifestation of exactly what John's ambition had cost. Sarasota, Florida, 1937. ca. Design has been locked for over a year. No heat, no staff, no maintenance, and Florida humidity doesn't wait. Within 6 months of John's death, the damage begins. Not dramatically, not with collapsed ceilings or shattered windows. It starts microscopically. Sarasota Bay sits at 27 degrees north latitude. The average humidity is 78%. During summer, it reaches 90%. That moisture carries salt, sodium chloride, magnesium chloride, calcium sulfate. These molecules are small enough to pass through window seals, through door frames, through the ventilation grills that were designed to keep the house cool. They settle on surfaces, paintings, furniture, marble, and they begin chemical reactions. The Rubens painting in the living room, The Gathering of the Manna, is oil on canvas. The canvas is linen, organic material. In controlled museum conditions, at 65 degrees and 50% humidity, that canvas can last centuries. In uncontrolled Florida humidity, with salt air accumulating on the surface, the linen fibers begin to degrade within months. The weave loosens. The paint layer, no longer supported by tight canvas, develops microscopic cracks. By 1938, visible damage appears, small areas where the paint is lifted from the canvas, tiny bubbles, flaking. By 1940, entire sections of detail are gone, faces, hands, background figures. A $2 million painting being eaten by salt air. The same process is happening to all 600 paintings in the collection. The Velázquez portraits, the Franz Halls, the Italian Renaissance pieces Mabel spent years selecting. No one is monitoring them. No one is controlling the humidity. No one is even aware it's happening until it's too late. Meanwhile, the marble terraces are experiencing their own dissolution. The Carrara marble, the same stone Michelangelo used, is calcium carbonate. In dry conditions, it's stable for millennia. But in contact with salt water, calcium carbonate reacts. It forms calcium chloride, which is water-soluble. Every time it rains, a microscopic layer of marble dissolves, washes away into the bay. The geometric patterns Mabel had designed, the floor that was supposed to evoke the Doge's palace, is literally disappearing molecule by molecule. The terracotta tiles on the facade are faring slightly better. Terracotta is fired clay, more resistant to salt. But the mortar between the tiles is limestone-based. It's dissolving faster than the marble. By 1942, tiles are coming loose, falling from the upper stories, shattering on the terrace below. The bell tower, the 80-foot statement Mabel designed to be visible for miles, develops cracks. Water seeps in. The steel reinforcement begins to rust. Rust expands. Its basic chemistry, iron oxide, takes up more space than iron. The expanding rust pushes against the terracotta from the inside. More cracks, more water intrusion, more rust. It's a feedback loop. Decay accelerating decay. Inside the house, a different kind of destruction is happening. Mold. The genus is Stachybotrys, black mold. It thrives in humidity above 70%. It grows on organic materials, wood, fabric, canvas. The Baroque furniture, the 16th century credenzas with their original upholstery, become breeding grounds. By 1943, the tapestries in the ballroom are covered in black patches. The velvet drapes have rotted. The wooden floors are warped. The Aeolian organ, the 4,000-pipe instrument that cost $60,000, is dying. The wooden pipes are splitting. Humidity has swollen the wood, then dry periods have caused it to contract. The cycles of expansion and contraction create fractures. The metal pipes are corroding. The salt air has oxidized the brass, the copper, the steel. The pneumatic tubes that carried air pressure from the console to the pipes have dried out and cracked. If someone tried to play the organ in 1944, most of the pipes wouldn't sound, and the ones that did would be badly out of tune. The voice of God has become a wheeze. But perhaps the cruelest damage is happening to Mabel's bedroom. The copper mosquito screens, the ones that made her final years so airless, have turned green. Copper oxide, the result of salt air oxidation. The Baroque bed, the carved walnut with gold leaf, is covered in mold. The imported silk canopy has rotted completely. It hangs in strips, like torn flesh. This is the room where Mabel died, where she struggled to breathe behind screens that were supposed to protect her. And now it looks like a tomb that's been sealed for decades instead of 7 years. Throughout all this decay, there are legal battles. Emily is still suing for her share of the estate. Creditors are trying to force the sale of the property. The state of Florida is trying to finalize the donation agreement John had started before his death. But no one is actually maintaining the building. It's caught in legal limbo. Too valuable to abandon. Too complicated to settle. So it rots. By 1946, 10 years after John's death, the damage is catastrophic. Art historians who finally gain access to assess the collection estimate that 40% of the paintings have suffered irreversible damage. Some can be restored, with money, with expertise, with time. But some are simply gone. The salt air and mold have destroyed them beyond recovery. Millions of dollars in Renaissance art, collected over 30 years, destroyed in a decade. Because John spent everything proving he belonged among the elite, and nothing ensuring his collection would survive him. The palazzo he built to establish his legacy had become the mechanism of its destruction. But in 1946, something changes. The legal battles finally resolve. The state of Florida officially accepts the donation. C.A. Dezan and the art collection become public property. And in that transfer, in that final transformation from private palace to public museum, John Ringling finally gets what he wanted, just not the way he imagined. 1946. The legal battles end. After 10 years of court proceedings, creditor claims, and bureaucratic negotiations, the state of Florida officially accepts John Ringling's donation. C.A. Dezan becomes public property. The art collection becomes the John and Mabel Ringling Museum of Art. It's not what John imagined when he signed the provisional agreement in 1931. He'd envisioned a grand opening, a ceremony, his name carved in marble at the entrance while he stood there to see it. Instead, he's been dead for a decade. The palace has rotted for 10 years, and the state accepts it not as a triumph, but as a salvage operation. But here's what John got right. He understood that the only way to make his name permanent was to give everything away. The Metropolitan Club never let him in. The Vanderbilts never acknowledged him. New York society never accepted that a circus man belonged among them. But in 1946, when the museum opens to the public, 10,000 people visit in the first month. Not society members, not old money families, regular people, working people. The same people who'd bought circus tickets decades earlier. They walk through the rooms John and Mabel designed. They see the Rubens paintings, the Baroque furniture, the Venetian tiles. They stand in the ballroom, where the pipe organ still sits silent behind its grills. And they see what John couldn't buy but accidentally created anyway. Not legitimacy among the elite, but access for everyone else. The palazzo that was built to prove John belonged among aristocrats became proof that art doesn't belong to aristocrats at all, that Renaissance paintings can hang in Florida, that Venetian palaces can be public museums, that a circus man's collection can educate more people than all the private estates on Fifth Avenue combined. This wasn't John's intention. He wanted exclusivity. He wanted the Vanderbilts to walk through C.A. Dezan and feel inadequate. But by dying broke, by being forced to donate rather than sell, by losing control of his own legacy, he accidentally achieved something more lasting. He made beauty democratic. Today, the Ringling Museum is the State Art Museum of Florida. Over 400,000 people visit annually. They see the collection Mabel curated, the paintings John bought, the palace they built together. The restoration work has been extensive. The salt damage has been repaired where possible. The paintings that could be saved have been conserved. The organ has been restored and plays again. C.A. Dezan looks now roughly how it looked in 1926, except the gates are open. There are no servants in the basement working 15-hour days, no exclusive dinner parties, No guests arriving by yacht to admire the sunset through floor-to-ceiling windows while champagne appears as if by magic. Instead, there are school groups, families, art students, tourists, people who would never have been invited when John was alive. And that's the final irony. John spent his entire fortune trying to prove he was worthy of a world that didn't want him. He built a palace to force recognition from people who would never grant it. And in losing everything, in being forced to give it all away, he created something those people never could. A legacy that belongs to everyone. The circus king who died with $311 achieved immortality, not through exclusivity, but through its opposite. His name is on a museum that will outlast every private club that rejected him. His collection is seen by more people in a single year than the Vanderbilts entertained in their entire lives. And the palazzo that was supposed to be a monument to his arrival among the elite became a monument to something better. The democratization of beauty. John Ringling died, believing he'd failed, that the palazzo was a waste, that the collection was meaningless if he couldn't use it to buy social acceptance. He was wrong. He succeeded, just not in the way he intended. In ca. Dizan, the House of John, finally became what Mabel might have wanted all along. Not a fortress, not a statement, a gift. Which brings us back to where we started. New York, 1936. A Park Avenue apartment. A man dying with $311. We've performed the autopsy. We've examined the evidence. We've traced the pathology from Wisconsin poverty to Venetian palace to Florida decay. Now we can answer the question we asked at the beginning. How did this happen? How did a man with $200 million die with 311? The answer isn't economics. It's psychology. John Ringling spent his entire life trying to buy something that wasn't for sale. Acceptance, legitimacy, the approval of people who would never grant it. He built an empire. He revolutionized entertainment. He created infrastructure. He collected masterpieces. And none of it mattered to the people whose approval he wanted. So he kept building, kept buying, kept expanding, even when it stopped making sense, even when the economy collapsed, even when his own workers were starving. Because stopping would mean admitting the palazzo didn't work, that the Rubens paintings didn't prove what he needed them to prove, that you cannot build a bridge between circus tents and Metropolitan Club memberships. The $311 wasn't the result of bad luck or poor timing. It was the mathematical endpoint of a life spent chasing validation from people who were never going to provide it. But here's what the forensic examination reveals. The pathology that killed John Ringling created something he never intended. By dying broke, by being forced to donate rather than hoard, he accidentally built a legacy more democratic than anything the families who rejected him ever created. ca. Dizan stands today not as John's monument, but as Mabel's, as the workers who built it, as belonging to the 400,000 people who visit annually. The palazzo that was supposed to prove John belonged among the elite proved something else entirely. That beauty doesn't need permission, that culture doesn't require aristocracy, that a circus man's palace can teach more people about Renaissance art than 1,000 private collections locked behind gates. If you ever visit Sarasota, you can walk through ca. Dizan yourself. You can stand in the ballroom. You can see the Rubens. You can look out at the bay from the terrace, where John and Mabel once stood. The gates are open. The admission is reasonable. The organ plays concerts for the public. John Ringling built a cage, trying to prove he deserved freedom. And in losing everything, he accidentally unlocked the door for everyone else. That's not the immortality he wanted. But it's the immortality he got. And it's probably better.